There is a particular kind of silence that many people from Gen X carry into a room. It is not the silence of someone with nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who decided somewhere along the way that saying it would not change anything. Ask them why they made a decision, why they left a job, why they stopped calling someone back. You will often get a short answer, sometimes only a shrug, rarely a full explanation. This is not evasiveness in the ordinary sense. It is something quieter and more deliberate than simple avoidance. Many people assume this reflects indifference, as though the person does not care enough to elaborate. But indifference does not usually produce this particular texture of silence. What produces it is closer to a private, long-held conclusion. Explanations, in their experience, rarely land the way they were intended to. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, an entire generation seems to have learned that justifying yourself is often a wasted effort. You may recognize this pattern in a parent, a colleague, or in yourself. A statement is made once, plainly, and the subject is considered closed. This happens regardless of whether anyone else actually understood it. The visible behavior shows up in small, repeated moments rather than dramatic ones. A Gen X coworker will announce a decision instead of proposing it for open discussion. A Gen X parent will state a boundary once and refuse to renegotiate it, even when a child pushes for more detail. A Gen X friend will decline an invitation with a single sentence and offer no further context. This often leaves the other person wondering whether something is wrong when nothing dramatic is happening at all. This generation tends to avoid long justifications during conflict. They prefer instead to withdraw quietly or to restate a position without elaboration. Younger colleagues often describe them as blunt. Older relatives often describe them as stubborn. Neither description quite captures what is happening underneath. There is rarely anger in this silence, and rarely even active resistance. There is mostly a kind of quiet closure, as though the conversation had already been settled internally. It was settled before anyone else was ever invited into it. The explanation, if it ever existed at all, was already given to no one but themselves. This pattern extends beyond conflict into ordinary daily exchanges as well. A Gen X sibling may skip a family event without offering much reason, simply saying they cannot make it this time. A Gen X employee may leave a long-held position with a two-line resignation, giving colleagues almost nothing to work with afterward. Even praise tends to move through the same filter, offered briefly and rarely elaborated upon further. Compliments are accepted with a nod rather than expanded into a longer conversation. The pattern is consistent across contexts that otherwise have little in common with one another. Whether the moment involves conflict, celebration, or simple daily logistics, the underlying instinct is the same. Say only what is necessary and let the rest remain unspoken.
Underneath these behaviors sits a specific psychological mechanism. It concerns how repeated invalidation shapes communication style over time. When a person's explanations are consistently dismissed, misheard, or later used against them, the brain gradually reclassifies explaining itself as a low-value action. This is not a conscious philosophy that someone sits down and decides upon. It is closer to a learned prediction built slowly through accumulated experience. The nervous system begins to treat justification the way it treats any repeatedly unrewarded behavior. It quietly reduces its investment in that behavior over time. Attachment researchers describe something similar in avoidant attachment patterns. A child who repeatedly reaches out and receives inconsistent or dismissive responses eventually stops reaching. This is not because the underlying need for connection disappears. It happens because the specific act of asking becomes associated with disappointment. For many Gen X individuals, this pattern was not confined to one relationship or one household. It was reinforced across an entire childhood environment. Homes, schools, and other institutions were rarely designed to listen closely to a child's reasoning in the first place. If this description feels familiar, you are not alone in recognizing it. and the pattern only continues to deepen from here. If these ideas resonate with you, consider subscribing for more thoughtful explorations of psychology and human behavior. The analysis continues because this particular silence did not appear in a vacuum. That environment deserves closer attention because the pattern did not simply emerge on its own. Gen X children were raised largely by parents shaped by the aftermath of 2 world wars and the economic uncertainty that followed. Those parents were themselves taught that emotional expression was a luxury rather than a necessity. Households of that era were often organized around function rather than dialogue. They were built around getting through the day rather than discussing it. Rules were issued in these homes, not debated with the children who received them. A child asking why a decision had been made was frequently met with the familiar answer, "Because I said so," offered as though it were sufficient reasoning on its own. This was not always intended as cruelty toward the child receiving it. It was frequently exhaustion, cultural habit, and a genuine belief that children needed compliance rather than reasons. At the same time, Gen X came of age during a period when both parents were increasingly likely to work outside the home. Latchkey routines became common, and children were expected to manage themselves after school. There was often no adult present to hear about the day once it was over. Explaining your choices or your feelings to an available adult was frequently not an option at all, simply because the available adult was not there to receive it. Television and popular culture during these years quietly echoed the same message back to children absorbing it. Independence was frequently framed as admirable, while emotional openness was more often framed as excessive or unnecessary. Divorce rates rose sharply during this period. Many Gen X children navigated new stepfamilies, custody arrangements, and shifting households with very little guidance on how to talk about any of it. Adults around them were often preoccupied with their own upheaval, leaving limited room to sit with a child's confusion or grief. Children adapted by learning to manage these feelings internally rather than voicing them to adults who had little capacity left to receive them.
This was less a single lesson than a slow accumulation of small, repeated signals across an entire childhood. Institutions reinforced the same underlying lesson throughout childhood and adolescence. Schools of that period rarely asked children to articulate their reasoning. They asked mainly for correct answers and obedient behavior in return. Authority figures were rarely required to justify their decisions to the children affected by them. This meant children absorbed an implicit hierarchy, one in which explanation flowed downward and never upward. A teacher did not need to explain a punishment to the student receiving it. A coach did not need to explain a decision to the player affected by it. A parent did not need to explain a rule to the child expected to follow it without question. Over time, the absence of reciprocal explanation became the normal shape of communication itself. It quietly set the expectations that would follow these children long into their adult lives. It was not that Gen X children never tried to explain themselves in the first place. Many did, repeatedly, especially in early childhood, often with real effort and real hope of being heard by someone. What changed over time was the response they consistently received. Eventually, the effort itself began to quietly fade away. This is where the underlying adaptation becomes visible and where it begins to take a more permanent shape. Faced with an environment where explanation was rarely met with genuine listening, many Gen X individuals developed something that might be called functional self-containment. They learned to make decisions internally, to weigh consequences privately, and to present only the conclusion rather than the reasoning behind it. This adaptation served an important and understandable purpose at the time it formed. It reduced vulnerability in environments where vulnerability was often unrewarded or even quietly punished when it appeared. It allowed a person to maintain a stable sense of self even when the surrounding adults were inconsistent or emotionally unavailable. Hyper-independence, distrust of authority, and emotional distance were not personality flaws in this particular context. They were reasonable, even efficient responses to a very specific and repeated set of conditions. A person who stops explaining themselves to an audience that never truly listens is not becoming cold. They are conserving energy for an environment that has already shown them the likely outcome in advance. The difficulty is that this adaptation does not remain safely confined to childhood, where it first developed and made sense. It travels forward, largely unexamined, into an adulthood where the original conditions have often changed. The response itself, however, has usually not changed along with them. In relationships, this can appear as a partner who withdraws during conflict rather than working through it aloud together. This is not because they do not care about the relationship in front of them. It happens because some earlier part of them still expects explanation to be ultimately futile. In the workplace, it can appear as a manager who makes decisions unilaterally rather than inviting input from a team. They may have learned long ago that consensus building rarely changes the final outcome anyway. In parenting, it can appear as someone who quietly struggles to model open communication for their own children. This often happens even while they consciously want to parent differently than their own parents once did. The identity effects run deeper than these individual moments might suggest on their own. Many Gen X adults describe a persistent sense of being misunderstood by the people closest to them. This feeling is often paired, paradoxically, with very little effort to correct that misunderstanding. Correcting it, after all, would require exactly the kind of explanation they long ago concluded was not worth attempting in the first place. This same pattern surfaces again in how many Gen X adults approach aging and health. Symptoms are frequently minimized rather than described in full to a doctor or a concerned family member. Physical pain is often mentioned briefly, then quickly waved aside before anyone can ask a follow-up question. Financial difficulty is handled quietly and alone, rarely disclosed even to a spouse until circumstances make it impossible to hide any longer. In each of these situations, the same early lesson continues operating well beneath conscious awareness. Explaining a struggle in detail rarely felt worth the risk in childhood, and that old calculation continues running decades later, largely unexamined and rarely questioned. This produces a quiet paradox that sits at the very center of the entire pattern.
The same silence that once protected a person from repeated disappointment can eventually isolate them instead. It becomes the very thing that separates them from the connection they actually want. A person may deeply wish to be understood by a partner, a child, or a close friend. At the same time, they may refuse almost reflexively to provide the explanation that real understanding would require. This is not hypocrisy, and it rarely feels contradictory from the inside. It is the residue of a learned equation, one in which explaining and being hurt were once closely linked together. The link was formed so tightly that the nervous system no longer clearly distinguishes between an old, unsafe audience and a genuinely safe one standing in front of them now. The contradiction is rarely conscious in the moment it quietly appears. Most people living inside this pattern do not experience it as an active decision at all. They experience it simply as who they are, a fixed feature of temperament. It rarely registers as a strategy that once made sense and has since quietly outlived its original purpose. There is a further layer beneath even this contradiction, one that rarely surfaces in ordinary conversation. Many Gen X individuals privately want to be asked more questions than anyone actually asks them. At the same time, they will rarely admit this want out loud to another person. To admit it would mean acknowledging a need for explanation to matter, and that admission feels, to them, dangerously close to the vulnerability they spent decades learning to avoid. This is the paradox inside the paradox. The very defense that protects them from disappointment also prevents them from ever testing whether disappointment is still the likely outcome. The world around them has often changed since childhood. Many of the people now asking for explanation are not the dismissive authority figures of decades past, and yet the old prediction continues running quietly in the background, coloring interactions that have nothing to do with the past that originally produced it. Seen from a wider angle, this is not really a story about one generation alone. It is a story about how human beings adapt to the specific listening conditions of their early environment, whatever era that environment happens to belong to. Those adaptations tend to persist long after the environment itself has already changed around them. Every generation inherits a communication style shaped by the institutions, technologies, and family structures available to it at the time. Every generation eventually discovers that the style which once kept them safe does not automatically transfer to the relationships they go on to build afterward. Silence, understood this way, is not unique to Gen X at all. It is one of the oldest human responses to an environment that does not reward vulnerability. It appears wherever explanation has repeatedly failed to produce real understanding, across families, across cultures, and across eras far beyond this one alone. What changes from generation to generation is not the underlying mechanism. What changes is only the specific silence each one learns to carry. Earlier generations carried their own versions of this same quiet arithmetic, shaped by war, scarcity, or rigid social expectation rather than by latchkey afternoons. Later generations, raised inside more constant digital connection, are already developing their own distinct relationship to explanation, shaped by very different pressures and very different audiences. What remains constant across all of these variations is the basic equation itself. When explanation is repeatedly met with genuine listening, people continue offering it freely throughout their lives. When explanation is repeatedly met with dismissal, people eventually stop offering it at all, regardless of the century, the culture, or the household they happen to grow up inside. What remains, in the end, is not a lesson, but simply an observation. A generation taught early that explanation rarely changes an outcome will continue behaving as though that remains true. This continues even in rooms where it quietly no longer is. The habit outlives the specific conditions that first created it. It shapes conversations that could otherwise go differently, in homes and workplaces built by people who are still, in some private way, waiting. They are waiting to be asked the right way, by someone willing to actually listen to the answer. And somewhere, beneath the silence, many of them are still waiting to remember what it once felt like to give one.